Welcome everybody to the Parks lecture for 2025. My name's Neil Gregor. I've got to a point where I have to check in my script and read that out. I'm director of the Parks Institute as well as Professor of Modern European History here, and so it's my privilege to say a few words about the person about whom both the lecture and of course the Institute itself is named. James Parks was very many different things, and the whole was more than the sum of the parts. He belonged to the generation that went through the First World War. He was ordained as an Anglican priest in the 1920s, and the first stage of his career lay in Christian youth and reconciliation work in continental Europe. His stay there was cut short by the Nazi takeover of power, and he returned to the UK to embark upon a doctorate, trying to understand the origins of the anti-Semitism that he had first encountered there. And the result was his magnum opus, The Conflict of the Church and the Synagogue, published in 1934. Contrary to the prevailing consensus, which generally sought to explain anti-Semitism in terms of the economic and social resentments prevailing through history, and certainly contrary to what the Anglican Church itself wanted to accept and wanted to hear, he located the origins of anti-Semitism in the very early history of the Christian Church itself. His arrival at that position marked the onset of a lifelong engagement with both the past and the present of anti-Semitism, and an engagement with the history of the Jewish faith tradition, its history and its culture that sought to make amends, as he saw it, for the sins of his own tradition. He was instrumental in the foundation of the Council of Christians and Jews in the Second World War. He was very active in campaigning on behalf of Jewish refugees from National Socialism in the 30s and 40s. Beyond his academic interests, beyond his occasional theological writings, he also developed a career as a more public commentator and communicator on a wide range of matters, ranging from the history of anti-Semitism to the history and present of Palestine and Israel as it became. He remained active really down to the 1970s, and he died in 1981. And before that, when he retired, he gave his personal library to the University of Southampton, where it's grown into today's Parks Institute for the Study of Jewish, Non-Jewish Relations. His simultaneous commitments as academic, campaigner, public commentator, and occasional preacher produced a public persona that, as I say, was always more than the sum of its parts. And it's this character that we seek to channel and we seek to reproduce in the work of the Institute that bears his name. Academic work, teaching, public engagement, and outreach, generously supported by both the university itself, whose support we gratefully acknowledge here, and equally generously supported by a range of philanthropic donors, has enabled us to really to engage with a very wide range of interlocutors, from fellow scholars around the world, to local schools, to various community groups, all working at all times in the spirit of Parks's own commitment. A commitment to move through the world and to act upon it. Now, that mixture of his high-powered thought on the one hand and action in the world on the other is very much in evidence in the subject of tonight's talk. Hannah Arendt, a very different scholar, but with something of that same kind of character. And this is just one of the reasons why we're delighted to welcome tonight's speaker, about whom more in a moment. But Parks was also very much also about dialogue. And it's very much in keeping with that ethos too, that we've invited tonight's speaker to talk not in the format of a formal lecture, but in conversation with two of our colleagues here. Now, our VP, Vice President for EDI, Pascal Matthias, is going to chair the discussion itself. But But before I hand over to him, I'm very pleased to pause and move over into another Parks Institute tradition, which is the giving of our prizes to students for the best work in various categories in the last academic year. There are 3 of these. The first 2 are our Moster prizes, which we give to the best pieces of undergraduate and postgraduate essay work, and they're made possible by the generous support of the Moss family, which is always a great pleasure to acknowledge, and I'm particularly pleased that Liz is here to award those prizes. So I don't know if you want to say anything, Liz, or you don't have to, but you're welcome to. Do come up and...
I'm here. The award came about because my late husband and I met at university. We both studied law, and it's funny actually because we used to spend a lot of time in what was then the Parks Library, which was in the Hartley building, and many happy hours spent there because it was always very quiet and reverential, and you could really concentrate on your work. So it was great. As I say, sadly, my husband died young. We're in a way our own Parks Institute because I'm not Jewish and my husband was Jewish. So we had our own relationship in that respect. I was very touched and honoured when my father-in-law, Sidney Moss, who died at the grand old age of 97 last year, decided that it would be fitting to give an endowment to the university to award prizes, and he particularly was very interested in the work of the park. So it's my honour to come down every year and present the prizes. Now, I just need to know if any of the students are here.
They are. So you get to hold that.
Thank you.
I get to read out a couple of laudatios, and the first one then goes to Zofia Mikolajczuk, who is wonderful to have her here, and that's for her essay discussing the ways in which the responses of the Frank family were or weren't typical of how German Jews responded to the presence of Nazism. And the judges found it to be a very well written, very clearly structured and logical essay, all of which greatly enhances its readability. It demonstrates meticulous research, effectively incorporating both primary sources and a wide range of secondary literature. The analysis is nuanced, displaying intellectual maturity and curiosity, particularly in its critique of Marion Kaplan's work and its exploration of gendered and class-based dimensions of German Jewish experience. Overall, Zofia's essay is both convincing and perceptive, showing an impressive level of analytical focus, interpretation, and scholarly grounding for a first-year essay. So, Zofia, do come down and accept our congratulations. And so the postgraduate prize, postgraduate Moss Prize, goes to Alex Potter for her work on the module The Holocaust as Public History. The judges deemed that Alex designed a very impressive lesson plan for secondary school teaching on the Holocaust based on an imaginative use of interesting primary sources, particular pieces of testimony. It was carefully chosen to engage the students with the individual victim and the wider history of the Holocaust. A lot of effort went into Alex's proposed lesson plan, timings, and the desired outcomes. There was detailed reading underpinning the lesson and awareness of the challenges for students of different abilities and interests. The examiners concluded that it was a very professional and thoughtful piece of work. So, Alex, do come and Welcome. Don't feel bad because I'd like you to do the other one if you don't mind.
Oh, okay.
Because Dawn can't be here. So the final prize is the Cesarani Prize, which is awarded to the author of the best undergraduate dissertation in the fields of interest of the Institute. It's named after the distinguished Holocaust scholar and much loved one-time former colleague here, David Cesarani, who sadly passed away in 2015. Now, his partner, Dawn Waterman, unfortunately can't be here to award the prize in person tonight, so I've retained Liz for these purposes, and I'm very pleased to announce that the winner of the Cesarani Prize this year is Annabelle Wilcox for her dissertation on the Polish kinder transport children, an exploration of their aftercare and its impact. The judges found this to be an outstanding dissertation. The author has chosen a fascinating topic and carved out a niche for herself in the burgeoning field of kinder transport historiography. The dissertation highlights the author's outstanding grasp of the field. The author not only knows her subject inside out, but she's also fully capable of entering into a conversation with the existing scholarship. She demonstrates attention to detail, nuance, and thoughtfulness in the analysis of the source and evaluation that are unusual at undergraduate level. There's a maturity in her way of dealing with varied or even conflicting accounts and making sense of them by considering carefully the different personal histories and the context, how representative or unique they are. So again, well done, Annabelle, and do come down and accept our congratulations. Well done. Thanks ever so much. Right, and now, Pascal, over to you for the remainder of the evening. Okay,
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you. Everyone, okay. You hear me okay? Hello, everyone. My name is Pascal Mathias. It's customary that I thank everyone for coming. I'm not going to do that today. I'm going to congratulate you. I'm going to congratulate you for being here. I'm going to take it as assumed that everyone in here is very interested and very active in what we'll be discussing tonight. My role as Associate Vice President for EDI and Social Justice, which is a ridiculously long title and probably doesn't mean much to you. But the way that I summate that is I'm very interested in looking at narrowing gaps and shortening distances between what we think we know and what we need to know, and how that can really bridge togetherness, compassion, love in the world that we live in. And I think there's no more better time than to be here to listen to what we're going to be discussing today. So I'm not going to thank you, I'm going to congratulate you for just being here in the room and being part of this conversation. And I think these conversations, these dialogues here with Lyndsey today, and reading your book, it's incredibly emotional in terms of how you discuss. I think in this world, we need better conversations, and that takes radical active listening. And I think that's, to listen's a political act. So thank you. I said I wasn't going to say thank you, but I kind of am. Thank you for actually being here to listen. So it's an absolute pleasure to introduce our distinguished guest, Professor Lyndsey Stonebridge. So I've got a bit of blurb, which I'm going to read for you. A leading thinker in the fields of humanities and human rights, and currently based at the University of Birmingham. Lyndsey's work has shaped how we understand the relationship between literature, history, and human rights, and she has a remarkable ability to bring political philosophy to life in ways that feel urgent, relevant, and deeply personal. And I think that personalization is really, really important in making groups that often I speak to people that are already doing the work. And I think, how do we get other people in the room to actively listen and actively change the world that we do in? And I think, Lyndsey, that you do this fantastically. Among Lyndsey's many acclaimed works, including The Judicial Imagination, Writing After Nuremberg, 2011, won the British Academy's Rosemary Crochet Prize, while Placeless People, Writing Rights and Refugees 2018 was awarded the Modernist Studies Medal Association Best Book Prize. So these books demonstrate her commitment to examining the way justice, displacement, and storytelling shape our world. So my background, I have a very varied background, but my background was in film. I studied film at Manchester Metropolitan back in the 90s. And quite often the work that I do as Associate Vice President is more around storytelling and not just being able to augment and center other people's stories, but finding a way that make those stories real and relevant. And I think that will come out today, and it definitely does come out in your book, Lyndsey. Most recently, Lyndsey has given us the extraordinary meditation on the life and ideas of Hannah Arendt, and in We Are Free to Change the World, Hannah Arendt's lessons in love and disobedience. And disobedience is quite, it's such a fantastic word to use, and hopefully that gets drawn out today. I guess in my role at the university, it's sometimes seen as a word which you can't use, but I absolutely think that we should all disobey lovingly, in a way that is, again, a political act. So the book has already been shortlisted for the Orwell Prize. In this book, Lyndsey takes us on a journey through radical thinking, reflections on power, freedom, and resistance, and reveals just how much these ideas matter in today's turbulent political landscape. And I use the word turbulent as an understatement as well. This is not just an intellectual biography, but a call to action, reminding us that thought and disobedience are essential ingredients for change. This evening, we're lucky to have her in conversation with two brilliant scholars. Professor Devorah Brown, whose wide-ranging work explores psychoanalysis, literature, and Jewish studies, and who is currently preparing a volume on psychoanalysis and Jewish thought. And Dr. Jonathan Leader, whose doctoral research focuses on Hannah Arendt and who is currently working on a short book about her philosophy. So I'll hand over, I don't want you not come here to listen to me all night. So I'll hand over to them for a discussion, which will run for about 45 minutes to an hour. Then I will chair, I'll keep close eye on the time, and then we'll open up the floor to questions. So please, can we put our hands together for Lyndsey and our colleagues today, and enjoy the conversation. Thank you.
Hello, good evening. We're not assuming that everybody here or online actually knows a lot about Hannah Arendt. So I'm just going to spend about 3 minutes, 56 seconds, giving you a bit of an outline about her before we actually get into the questions and the discussion. Hannah Arendt stands as one of the most penetrating, provocative, but also poetic political thinkers of the 20th century. Born into a secular Jewish family in Hanover in 1906, she studied with philosophers Martin Heidegger and Karl Jaspers before fleeing Nazi Germany in 1933. Her personal experience of statelessness and exile profoundly shaped her political thinking and her understanding of the limits of human rights and the importance of political belonging. This experience had powerful expression in her 1943 essay, We Refugees, in which she reflected on the condition of Jewish refugees and the broader implications of statelessness. The essay's opening line, "In the first place, we don't like to be called refugees," launched a searing analysis of how the loss of political community affects human dignity and identity. Arendt's landmark book, The Origins of Totalitarianism, 1951, broke new ground in understanding how Nazi and Stalinist totalitarianism crystallized out of a number of different elements. And it's interesting that interest in that book soared after Donald Trump first became American president in 2016, and today's sales remain far in excess of what would be expected. Rather than viewing Nazi Germany and Stalinist Russia as typical dictatorships or tyrannies, as we might judge them to be, Arendt identified them as entirely new forms of domination based on terror. We might say anti-political phenomena that sought to eliminate human spontaneity itself. Her analysis of how totalitarian systems atomize individuals and destroy the public sphere remains deeply relevant for making sense of anti-political extremism today. In The Human Condition, 1958, Arendt provided us with what W.H. Auden described as a vocabulary for distinguishing the political activity through which human beings reveal themselves in public space. For Arendt, it was through political action that human freedom manifestly appears and through which we reveal ourselves as beings with a capacity to begin something new and unexpected. Her coverage of the Eichmann trial, published first in The New Yorker and then as Eichmann in Jerusalem, 1963, was an incendiary piece of writing sparking intense controversy, not least because of her proposition about the banality of evil, the report's subtitle. Eichmann, a Nazi key to the implementation of the final solution, was, Arendt argued, evil not out of demonic malice, but from a failure to think and judge independently. Arendt's enduring significance lies in her defense of political freedom, her insights into the fragility of democratic institutions, and her emphasis on the capacity for new beginnings. Her writings on revolution, violence, truth and untruth in politics, thinking, human rights, public and private social spaces, judging, civil disobedience, and willing, just for example, speak powerfully to contemporary concerns about democracy's vulnerability and the conditions for meaningful political action and personal responsibility. Lyndsey's book, We Are Free to Change the World, Hannah Arendt's Lessons in Love and Disobedience, offers a beautifully thought through exploration of Arendt's life and ideas, combining imaginative reconstruction with analytical rigor. There's illumination here, bringing a fresh, very clear, very personal perspective on who Hannah Arendt was. And getting a sense of who Hannah Arendt was may just help us a little to find a way through our own ever-darkening times between past and future. Hey. Lyndsey, welcome.
Thank you. It's great to be here. Can I just emphasize how great it is to be here? I'm a great fan of Parkes Institute. I've worked with colleagues at the Institute. I've been waiting to be asked here for years. And so it's wonderful. And thank you very much for your hospitality. The one moment of sadness, I think, is that Cora Kaplan's not here. And I was one of the generation of women who was lucky enough to be mentored by Cora. And one of the things that Cora was so great at was she was so intellectually generous, but she was intellectually generous because she was stubborn and she liked to disagree. But she was always curious about why people disagreed. And the last, one of the things Cora and I disagreed about was Hannah Arendt. So Cora, I know you're here. I'll do my best. But I just wanted to pay homage to Cora.
Thank you. Well, it's good to have you here. I'm going to start with an obvious question, I suppose. Hannah Arendt was very unconventional, controversial. political thinker, and maybe that's part of the reason today why she's so popular and people are attracted to her. But it wasn't always the case that she was. And certainly when I started reading her work, when I was first introduced to her back in the early 1980s, there was very, very little that had been written about her. I think Margaret Canavan had a small introductory book, and Bernard Crick had written about the defense of politics, and that was basically it. Now there's a bit of an industry really about it. My question is, what attracted you to her, and when and why?
Right. Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, I think we're probably same generation. So when I started reading Arendt, I read her quite secretly. These were the 1980s. Actually, the first time I came to Southampton was for a conference on sexual difference, and I got off at Parkway Station with a load of other people, and there's a big sign going, "Sexual difference this way," and these bemused-looking tourists. And so we were all reading a lot of French post-structuralism, and Arendt was not popular in France at that time. We were reading a lot of feminism. Arendt did not identify herself as a feminist. And you know, and the left were quite hostile towards Arendt at the time. So I first read The Human Condition by accident, and I'm not sure how many people have read it. It's not the place to start because it's an insane book. You do not know where this is coming from. It's part poetry, it's part myth, it's part philosophy. I just thought this is extraordinary. So I read her quietly, and then I worked on two books that she became very, very important to. The first was The Judicial Imagination, which was about writing about Nuremberg and the Eichmann trial. So I returned to her then, specifically about women who wrote about those trials. And then I wrote a book on the emergence of the category of statelessness and refugees. And her work on refugees, as you pointed out, was so central there. And then I thought, I said, I remember saying to her friend, I don't want anything else to do with her. She's driving me mad. And then Putin and Donald Trump happened. And I went for a walk with a friend, Sarah Churchwell, the historian. I said, I just don't want to do this. And she said, you're going to have to write this book. It's now. But I think her popularity is a kind of a double-edged sword. I mean, I have a theory, which is slightly frivolous, but not entirely, that if it wasn't for Twitter, I'm not sure we would have found Hannah Arendt again. She would have hated social media with a deep passion. I think she's right. I think she's absolutely, the things she predicted are absolutely right. But she was a great fan of Nietzsche. She loved Nietzsche. One of the things she took from Nietzsche was a gift for writing aphorisms, which happened to be tweet size. And so when Trump came in 2016, you suddenly had all these Hannah Arendt quotes, there is no dangerous thinking, thinking itself is dangerous. The ideal subject of totalitarian rule is not the convinced Nazi or the convinced communist, but the person who can no longer tell the difference between truth and reality. So people started thinking, great, and they went to her. What you don't realize is after the aphorism, there's a paragraph of kind of subclause that takes you forever to get through. And also, no one knew she was so beautiful. I mean, my copy of The Human Condition had Hannah Arendt with her worst haircut, and she's usually very good. We didn't have the internet, so we didn't know how glamorous she was. So those two things came together in, just when Putin and Trump and the authoritarian turn came. So it was a kind of frivolous reason which she'd be furious with. But it did mean that a new generation are now reading Arendt. And there are a new generation of people who are reading Arendt who aren't the people who you think would have been reading Arendt.
Yeah, she does seem to have a new readership. And I was saying earlier on to someone that I literally get a series of 5, 6 quotes, or certainly notifications every day of papers around the world that she's quoted in, or books where she's being quoted, or TV programs that are inspired by her, and she's mentioned constantly. There's an ever increasing flow of notifications about her work, many of which you can just get rid of because it's just a quick mention, but often quoting something, but again, very aphoristic, just taking the quote out of context, not really giving you very much else. But she's there. She's constantly being referred to. I'm just thinking she was married twice and had, I'm just thinking, at least 3 proposals, including W.H. Auden.
Yes.
In her lifetime. So,
Yeah, I mean, that was, she always felt guilty about turning Auden down, and they adored each other. And it's a kind of sort of gay straight marriage in heaven. But she just so at that stage, he was so kind of dissolute. She used to go and take his suits to the dry cleaners every week for
Yes.
him. And she's like, I can't cope with like, you know. Like,
Yeah.
But the other one I hadn't realised was Hans Morgenthau.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Mm.
Which was
Yes,
yeah.
is that the she said she was too old by then to
She's too
marry.
old,
She said
yeah.
if you were 20, I'd love you. And he said, I'd love you if you were 90.
Yeah.
And she was about, I don't know, she died at 69. didn't
She's
she?
died at
So-
69. She's in her mid-60s. I'm absolutely sympathetic. Like, for God's sake, I'm in my 60s, go away.
Yeah.
You know?
Mm.
Yeah. Yeah. But I think it's something you don't get from the image of her, because in my 1980s version of The Human Condition, there's this rather austere looking woman.
Mm.
And kind of cultural misogyny made people frightened of her anyway.
Mm.
But if you go into the archive, I hadn't realized that she was so much fun. I mean, she was a dancer. She threw the most outrageous New York
Mm.
New Year's Eve parties.
Mm.
You know, the night before she left Berlin, they drunk their way through an entire cellar of white wine. I mean, she was really fun. She used to like to dance on tables. She had a real thing about shoes.
Yeah.
And none of this, you know, came into the kind of cult. You know, she wasn't like Beauvoir or someone like that. She didn't have that kind of iconic status.
Mm.
But I think it does come from, because she did have a strong commitment to friendship and love and the world we're in. And that's where the good times
Yeah.
came from.
Yeah.
Yeah.
You mentioned in passing being a refugee, and I've referred to that essay that she wrote, which was a real, I think you use the word blistering, and I've used searing. It really is a strong critique. And my next question was sort of around that. So you observe, and I'm going to have to read because I've got a quote of yours in here. So and I haven't learnt it off by heart. So I've got, you observe at the start of your book that what Arendt offers us is, quote, a model of how to think when politics and history are tearing up all the safety rails, as they did in her time and as they have again in the 21st century. And I'm just wondering how being a refugee, and she quotes in her essay on Brecht, the fact that he calls the refugees messengers of ill tidings, not evil, messengers of ill tidings. I'm just wondering how you think her being a refugee contributed to the way she experienced the world around her. She was made stateless, obviously, and she went from to various countries before ending up in America. So how she experienced the world, thought about it, and even influenced her style of writing. Because I think there's something around her use of irony, for example, in that particular essay, but elsewhere.
Yeah.
I think you use the term ventriloquizing in one place. So I just wonder how you think about the sort of refugee.
I think there are
space.
two sides to that. One is, yes, statelessness and a refugee, but also as a Jewish refugee. And her thinking around her Jewishness and her thinking about statelessness and exile are very, very closely bound up. So, yes, I mean, she left in 1933, but the book she was working on when she left was a biography, a critical creative biography of Rahel von Hagen, who was a Jewish salonier, 18th, 19th century. And as Arendt started to tell her story, what Rahel tried to do was assimilate. She really tried to assimilate. And it drove her mad. And at the end of her life, she realized the impasse of assimilation. And that's what that book taught Arendt as well. I mean, it's young writing. I do recommend the Rahel book because it is intensely moving. Because it's this very young woman writing in the 30s about this woman in the 18th and 19th century, realizing that assimilation is kind of the death of your identity, right? As all this is happening. Anyway, she left in 1933 because she was caught in the Prussian State Library looking for evidence of government and NGO and other association and deliberate anti-Semitic propaganda. That's what she was there for.
Mm.
And the story goes that she was undercover because she was an academic. She didn't have a kind of Zionist activism profile.
Mm.
And the librarian tipped off the Gestapo because they thought it was a bit odd that this historian academic kept on coming in and asking for all the newspapers, the contemporaries. She wasn't doing history, right? And so she was caught and she was kept by the Gestapo, luckily by a rookie member of the Gestapo, who didn't really know what he was doing. And he found a way to get her out. She got out and she escaped across into Czechoslovakia, and then came to Paris, where she worked with Youth-Alaya, and she worked with getting particularly Eastern Jewish youth, adolescents to Palestine and training them up. So that part of her life, she later referred to herself as a social worker who did history and philosophy in my part-time, in my spare time. Right. So she started as a refugee activist.
Yeah.
But what that experience taught her, and specifically experience of Jewish refugees, is that the nation state will not protect you in its current form. Because what happens when nationalism and racism and anti-Semitism take over the functions of the state, which is to say, what happens when the law is trashed, what happens when the institutions that, keep democracy going are trashed, is you are utterly defenseless. And what she saw very clearly was that the discourse of human rights meant nothing at that point. If you did not have a community, if you couldn't function within a political community, if you were radically stateless, you were rightless. And she says a wonderful quote, she said it was a terrible quote, the world saw nothing sacred in the abstract nakedness of merely being human. And she said that's the baseline of where we are now. That's what totalitarianism is. It's about the superfluity of the human being. And so everything came from that question. Where do we then go? How can we look at the notion of political community? What might a state look like that protects people from nationalism and racism? So it meant everything to her. Just one point on the writing, absolutely right. I mean, some of Arendt's writing is tricky and hard because she's living it. I mean, the origins of totalitarianism she'd been working on actually since her late 20s and 30s, and a lot of it's essays and reviews that she then, when she finally gets to America, puts together in a book. So I call it like in a work of archive fever, because she's actually desperately trying to record what's happened in her time. And she never does so much research again, actually, for any of her books. She's really trying to grab it together. And she's writing in English. I mean, We Refugees, she wrote in English. So that's for the Menorah Journal. Yeah. And she was writing in her third language, fourth or fifth if you count Greek and Latin. But she was writing in English for the first time in the 40s. And in We Refugees, you can hear the estrangement. You can hear there's bits of syntax which are kind of German. So there's this, her kind of writing is between nations, it's between languages. I mean, she always said that, it wasn't that she always loved the German language. And she said, it wasn't the language that went mad. I think it did, but she said that. But she was always working between German and actually quite a lot of French as well. And she wrote 3 essays in French. Right. So you do get that kind of echo. And again, the irony, there is a great tradition of moral writing, which is ironic. I mean, Jean Amoret writes about this beautifully. And irony is basically when you repeat. Anyone who's got adolescent children will know how irony tips into sarcasm when you say something like, tidy up your room or get off the internet. Don't get off the internet. I mean, that is kind of how irony works, because what irony does is repeat the injurious statement back. Because there's nothing else to say. And Amory says this because, I'm going to literally tell you how I was tortured without having to use adjectives or great detail, because it's just, if I just tell you what they said to me while they were doing that to me, that's where the moral irony comes in. And Arendt is brilliant at it. Brilliant at it in We Refugees. Didn't work so well in Eichmann in Jerusalem.
No, No,
I
no.
mean, we all know when we think, you know, we're being clever and ironic,
yeah,
that sometimes there are political contexts when it's really important not to do that. Like,
yeah. Well, just starting that essay, calling it "We Refugees," and
Yeah.
then saying the first
We
thing,
don't like to
we
be called-
actually don't want to be called
Well,
refugees.
I
But
mean, who wants to
there
be?
was that
Yeah,
tinge of sarcasm
Yeah,
in that,
yeah.
wasn't there?
yeah,
Yeah, absolutely.
yeah.
Mm.
And anger.
And very, very, very angry
Yeah.
epic. I'm just thinking about what you were saying though about Raphael Varnhagen. I think it's a lovely book. There are some, at least one very strange chapter on
The dream.
the dreams, which I still can't fathom. But it's a book I go back to many, many times, and always see something new in it. And I think it's quite understated in many ways.
Yeah.
And,
Well, she said Rahul was my best friend.
my best friend.
And she was very young when she was writing it. But as I was trying to write the book, if you're writing a biography, you always have someone else's voice in your head. You have that person's voice in your head.
Mm.
I wrote this book during COVID, and actually having COVID with Hannah Arendt's voice in my head was not always great. And so it comes into the writing. You partly identify it.
Yeah.
You mime, you
Yeah.
pull out, you go in. And she did that. And quite often it's difficult to tell where Rahel starts and Arendt starts.
Mm.
And it's
Yeah.
very good that she did that, because a lot of the Rahel Varnhagen archive was destroyed and stolen,
Yes.
and we haven't got it.
Yeah.
And a lot of the stuff we've got is thanks to her little book.
Mm.
But it's also a lovely book about trying to write your way into your present through writing someone else's life.
Yeah.
And she was,
Mm.
I'd start there rather than
Yes.
the origins of
Yeah.
totalitarianism.
The other thing I'm thinking though, that I just didn't want to forget was, I think Arendt is a very accessible writer if you compare her to Heidegger and other people that, I mean, he invents his own language, and she seems on the face of it very accessible though. It's very easy to read, but then as you say, you get into it and there's a lot more there.
She does sort of different things. I mean, it does annoy me when people are like, but have you read Adorno?
Yeah.
But I think she saw, when she started off as an academic, she wrote a really wonderful dissertation on St. Augustine. But when she went to Berlin in her late 20s, she wanted to be a journalist and a reviewer.
Mm.
And she never lost the sense that sometimes you're writing and good writing always puts the self on the line. It just does.
Mm.
But she was writing for Partisan Review. She was writing for the New Yorker. She understood what it meant to be in public.
Mm.
There's other bits of her writing. I mean, her last book, Life of the Mind and the Human Condition. Then again, they look very obscure and difficult books, but they kind of,
Mm.
the Human Condition sold really well.
Mm. Yeah.
And I do think you get the sense of her. I mean, she's a German romanticist as well. So life is complicated, life is torturous, life is difficult. You have to find the metaphor. But she was desperate to communicate. She was a student of Karl Jaspers, so communication was really
Was the important
to
thing.
her.
Yeah.
And there's a little bit of showing off, but nothing like the showing off you get with Heidegger and Adorno, which is just like, indulge me.
Yes.
I'm not going to indulge you for 3,000 pages.
Can I jump in here?
Yes.
Can I steal the
Of
thing?
course. Please do. Yes.
I don't know how I do it. Do you think of her as one of your best friends?
My frenemy.
Is she your frenemy?
Yes, I do. Yes, I do. And which is like with all good best friends, you can get cross with them.
How are you cross with her?
Well, I'm still cross with her about Martin Heidegger.
Yeah,
If I was her friend, I would have said, don't call it. The guy's a Nazi. He's not said sorry. Time to move on. Mary McCarthy, who was her best friend, said, Hannah Arendt went back to Germany in 1949, and she went to Freiburg, where she knew Heidegger was. And she said to Mary McCarthy, I just really think I just want to see him. And Mary McCarthy said, oh, you're still in love with him. Of course you must. And do you think, Mary, that was the wrong advice?
Yeah.
Walk away. Anyway, I'm very cross. I mean, the incident over Little Rock in Arkansas and her reading of Race in America really annoys me. And in the chapter, in chapter on race, where I'm not having it. And I got into trouble for that. People are saying, well, she's not really racist. Yes, she is. Yes, she is.
Yeah, you do the best reading of that.
Yeah.
You really go into the nitty-gritty on that. But you do also, I think, I mean, you do it beautifully because you say that she tripped up over her own philosophy in a way that she became too closely identified with Elizabeth Eklund, and
Yeah.
then so the point, so her sort of love got
Yeah.
in the way of her politics, which is one of the, I mean, this is about love and disobedience, and Hannah Arendt as a lover is such an interesting theme in your book. There are so many different forms of love, and love is the best thing and politically the most toxic thing. Can we talk a little bit about that?
Yeah. Her book on, I mean, Augustine was really important to her as well. And what Augustine taught her is that we're made to love in the world. And that's how you guarantee plurality. So love is really, love is the beginning. You think of this young woman writing this in the 1920s, having just dumped Martin Heidegger. It was actually Heidegger who gave her the line. He wrote her a love letter and said, as Augustine said, "Volo ut sis." I love you, I want you to be. Augustine never said that. I mean, I've checked with Augustine people, I've gone through it, didn't quite say that. He sort of says, I love you as God loves you, which can be really, because a lot of you can do bad things if you're loving in God's name. But she ran with it. And then he used the same line for another lover of his who was also Jewish.
Heidegger did, not Augustine. Yeah.
Same line, right? So he just had this thing about, saying Jewish women that he really loved them, he wanted them to be, and then joining the Nazi party. So anyway, but she read beautiful, beautiful thesis in Augustine, which is, and the other thing she took, which is so important, is love is the beginning. So natality and birth, there is always the capacity to begin again. So she started off from the same place as her existential colleagues, which is to say there's no groundwork, there's no God, there's no, there's only us, there's only thinking. It's the Willie Coyote moment of philosophy where, when he's running off the cliff and looks underneath and goes, oh my God, that's the moment. And Heidegger said, only thing we know with certainty is we're being towards death. And she said, no, the only thing we know from certainty is we came from nowhere and that we came from love. We came from nothing. We came from nothing. Love is the beginning of everything. And I think that she lived that. So her friendships were really important to her. The pariah community, going back to your question about refugees, is what do you have when you have nothing? What do you have when you're in a camp? What do you have when you're in an exile community? Love. Love and passion. And she also talks beautifully about how love is bringing the absent present. I mean, love is just everywhere. But what she wouldn't do is make a politics of love. And that is, she just absolutely refused. There's a beautiful story when she was finishing her book on revolution, and she said, revolutions that are made in the name of love are really dangerous. Because pretty soon you start deciding who's lovable and who isn't. And so her big example was the French Revolution, Robespierre's, for pity's sake, be inhuman. So at what point does love turn murderous? And as she was finishing the proofs of that, she read James Baldwin's The Far Next Time, and what became The Far Next Time, in which Baldwin does this just astonishing argument for love and points this brilliant pointing out that white Americans cannot love, and that's why they're projecting their darkness into blackness. And she reads this and she writes to William Shawn. William Shawn had published Far Next Time, Rachel Carson's The Silent Spring, which is the big first environmentalist manifesto, and Hannah Arendt's Eichmann in Jerusalem, literally within 6 months of each other. Race, environment, the banality of evil, all within months of each other. So she writes to William Shawn and she says, I just read Baldwin's article. I can't think of anything else. I'm just like, electrified by it, because partly what Baldwin is saying about love is what she says, that love is creation, love is the meaning of being. Then she writes to him and says, I love this, but you can't have a politics of love. Love, like passion, like hate, must be kept out of politics. And Baldwin doesn't reply. She has a bit of a history of it. She writes to Ralph Ellison. She has a history of writing to
Can we
Blackman,
just
don't
have that,
reply.
the whole quote of the, do you mind if I,
Yeah.
I'm just going to read the whole quote because I find it so profound. She writes to Baldwin, in politics, love is a stranger, and when it intrudes upon it, nothing is being achieved except hypocrisy. All the characteristics you stress in the Negro people, their beauty, their capacity for joy, their warmth, their humanity, are the well-known characteristics of all oppressed people. They grow out of suffering, and they are the proudest possession of all pariahs. Unfortunately, they have never survived the hour of liberation by even 5 minutes. And then Baldwin later said, I think she was right
She was
about
right.
that.
He said he was absolutely right. I mean, he was being interviewed in a context when it was kind of one of those conversations that said, yeah, but it's kind of really good you've been so oppressed because then you get to be all this fabulous, lovey person. Paul was like, no, there's nothing good about this. And then he quotes that.
So love is not, I mean, again, and that brings the
Yeah.
Cullum argument in, that love can't really be a characteristic of a people.
Yeah.
Because actually love is a characteristic of a situation.
Yeah.
And so it can't be, you can't pin a politics you want to last on it.
Yeah.
Is that the idea?
I think she always saw, once you decide love in the name of, that can be in your communities, that can be one thing, in your families, in your friendship, of course. But if you try and make a state out of that, you will bring terror. That's what she thought. I mean, I think there are disagreements. I mean, theologians, I spoke to Vaughan Williamson about this a lot. They would say, no, the city of God is the city of God. And she did, but I think she'd been too pressed up too close to the passions of National Socialism. She'd seen what that kind of emotional, for the love of, was capable of doing, but she just pushed back. But I mean, the other thing that was a surprise to me, she was really keen on boundaries, and she's kind of keen on the boundaries you need to make plurality function. And when I first read Arendt, I was very hostile to this. I mean, I was sort of too like, well, of course we can, change the world. But what she actually meant is you have to withdraw a bit. You have to kind of like set up the things, the guardrails for plurality, which precisely mean backing off. And how do you have a politics that's capable of doing?
And then that's the sort of Kantian moment
is,
in
yeah.
her, of the sort of respectful distance between,
Yeah.
but I mean, it's so interesting that she divorces, makes a very strong boundary between love and politics in a sense, because you can't pin your politics on love.
Yeah.
But we come from love,
Yeah.
and this idea, I want and will you to be,
Yeah.
is the basis of her politics.
Exactly.
So
So she
it
does-
is about
But
plurality.
that's where she dovetails back on herself,
Mhm.
because the other thing she really loved
Mm.
were those moments of action that seemed to come from nowhere, that came from people. And that she thought was the origin of true politics and action. And so if you go back to the Eichmann book, you read the Eichmann book, the people, I haven't really clocked this, and I've read that book too many times, it can possibly be good for me. And she's really interested in the people who resisted, the people who acted, the people who did something else. And she finds them much more interesting than Adolf Eichmann. And so what's the radical good?
Mhm.
And the radical good is the capacity to act in good faith.
Mm.
And it could be out of love. I mean, quite often it is.
Because her, in a way, I mean, I suppose one of the critiques a little bit you get very around is she's a good diagnoser of the terrible evils,
Yeah.
but she hasn't necessarily come up with the political system.
Well, she'd
So-
say that's what I don't want to, because I
Yeah.
see what happens when people come up with political systems.
And yet there is, I suppose, in the mix of this, I mean, she's saying she wants to describe from the
Yeah.
outside in a way, or that she has a good vantage point on politics because she's been excluded
Yeah.
on the political domain, and she sees totalitarianism as an attack on the human condition, and the human condition is plurality. So do you have a sense of a kind of politics that can can accommodate the human condition, the kind of politics that Arendt subscribes to?
I see it everywhere and then it's nowhere. So, I mean, it's everywhere, but it's where people aren't looking.
Oh, that's good.
So, you know, some of the most Arendtian people at the moment, I think, are like the women of Iran, where they have politics of visibility and a politics of action. She was, you know, she didn't like ideological movements, but what she did like was when people came together to say, I don't know, this is enough, or we're going to take, you know, our means of living into our own hands. Yeah, I actually see it, God help me, in America, because America, every time you go to the States, I mean, I'm very European, but I'm always, I was there just after the book was published, just after Gaza was unfolding. And one of the very strange things, if you're not American, is this bloody hope. You think, stop hoping. America hopes everything gets really bad for everyone else. But there's still that tradition of associations and resistance and a kind of sense of entitlement, not a sense of entitlement in a bad way, but a sense of like, these are our worlds, these are our communities. These are the way we're going to act. You know, American activism is a very strong, powerful tradition.
Because in a way, the American idea
Yeah.
was the politics she came closest to
Yes.
endorsing until
Yeah.
she saw it
Yeah.
close up. And
Until Vietnam, until Watergate, and she would, I mean, she'd have seen where America was going, but the politics she liked was, you know, the politics of activism, but not activism's sake. I mean, she was very scathing about the men of the left, which were totally unfamiliar. People who know a lot about feminism, race, and identity, and are very keen to lead you into the light. And so she didn't like people making power movements, but she really liked that kind of, and the sense of spontaneity. She was, I mean, the person that she's very close to is Rosa Luxemburg in that respect. It's like you can't make a revolution happen. It will always come at its moment. So the chapter I did on revolution, I wrote half about her on revolution and half on Lebanon, which had a failed revolution.
Yeah, I feel that to some extent, I was saying this to you before, I sort of want, I'm desperate, as we all are, about the world. I'm very desperate. It's unbearable every day to face it, to face the situation we're in. And I read this book and I told you this, and it's honest about how bleak things are. And the hope that you get from it too becomes an odd kind of hope, because you are facing what you don't want to face. But one of the reasons I found it hopeful is, you say in Arendt's name, that she says at times like this, when we're in a state of emergency, the sort of big questions aren't less important.
They're more important.
They're more important. Now is the time to really ask, well, what is a human?
Yeah.
You know, what are we here for? What is love? So now is the time to do real thinking.
Yeah.
And I suppose, and thinking is a theme for Arendt, and a theme in your book, what is real thinking? And you know, one of the things she did say was, never again, I'll never get involved with that lot, when you just mentioned with academics.
Yeah.
Because she saw a sort of false consciousness in the academy, that people who think they're thinkers, like Eichmann too, in a way, but aren't. So do you perceive that? Where's the real thinking happening?
Yeah. Well, what's happening is it's being closed down. I mean, her sense of thinking was always about the ability to go, it's very Kantian, is to go visiting in other imaginations. So the capacity, it doesn't mean empathy, although that's be nice. It just means the capacity to go visiting, to see what the world looks like from someone else's point of view. And that really requires the nurturing of imagination. And so if you look at what's happening now, not only do we have the rise of second wave fascism, not only do we have a kind of, I mean, social media culture, which is like so conformist, that it's ruining our capacity to resist. You also have the attack on the humanities and teaching and education. which is, I think it's an attack on the imagination.
Yeah.
I mean, when she taught political science in Berkeley in 1955, you look at her syllabus and it's all novels. It's like, it's like, it's not theory. You're not going to be able to theorize your way out of this.
Mm.
You have to use the imagination to get your way out of this.
Mhm.
So I think we're in a very bad place. But the other thing, to go back to the other thing, she really is, you can imagine her being the most annoying friend, because every time you came up with some kind of solution that would be wishful thinking, they'd point out that this was a delusion of yours, sure, Kamala's going to get it, we're fine. And then, I'd literally been in New York days before and it was a hideous atmosphere. Not fine. And she would tell you, she would call it, because she really believed in common sense should be a shared reality of how things really are.
So one quote from your book, which really struck me, was you said Arendt was always prepared to believe the worst.
Yeah.
And
But that actually gave
Yeah.
her a real position of strength. I mean, she says elsewhere as well, and she right out of the Eichmann experience, she said, it's when you're most powerless that everything is so important. And then she says, and I think this is so brilliant, she says, it takes courage to realize how powerless you are. Because it's horrible. I mean, I hadn't realized that in the human condition she's so good on vulnerability that there is no capacity to do politics or do thinking without a very real, profound sense of one's own vulnerability, as it really is. So, I mean, it's hard. It's really hard to think this. And I think it's partly why, if you, in America now, people are just like, it's like things, it's like, do you know what's happening? And I can get that. I can get like, I just can't face the thought of being this vulnerable. Of course, there are lots of people who know what it feels like to be utterly vulnerable, but they're not people doing politics. But her, going back to your question about refugees, I think that's where it comes from. And she talks, I mean, the big chapter in Human Condition is on human frailty. That's the starting point for politics, is an acknowledgement of human frailty.
which is why you align her actually with Baldwin and Carson, and you
Yes,
feel that
yes.
these are thinkers
Yes.
along those lines.
Yeah, I mean,
And-
it is that kind of absolute sense of what humanity is, and therefore you need to love it and protect it. And all three of those thinkers had that strong moral sense of, Baldwin called it the constants.
Mm.
Um,
I know that we have to open, don't we, to a moment. Can I just ask one more question before we open? Or is it- Thank you. Because it was the question I was going to ask before, which I mentioned before, which is, it is true that we are living in a time when she seems like a prophet,
Yeah.
because the totalitarian subject doesn't know the difference between, or care about the difference
Yeah.
between truth and falsity, because the condition of loneliness, the loss of contact with others, because there's a pervasive sense of hatred for everything and everyone, all these sound bites, because cynicism is the modus operandi of so many institutions and lives, that she feels completely as if she's talking about our own time. But her main instruction to us as thinkers is to think anew, meet the moment in its specificity,
yeah.
not rely on past
Yeah,
thought.
yeah,
And so I guess the question is, how do we,
yeah,
what do we do with the
Yeah,
post-2016 Arendt?
yeah, yeah. No, it's such a great question, Dora. I mean, she did say in the origin, one of the most chilling passages in the Origins of Totalitarianism, when she says, totalitarian elements will remain long after totalitarian regimes have been collapsed, which is to say, there is a way of non-thinking that has now got into the culture. And Václav Havel said the same thing, so, what Czechoslovakia is going to discover is that the alienation of the loneliness are not the preserve of, regimes which have bad written on them. They're in late capitalism, they're certainly within neoliberalism. So there is a continuity. But on the other hand, which goes back to the point about imagination, she says very clearly, comprehension means facing up to the incomprehensible. She does not like analogies. I mean, she was appalled with readings of the Holocaust, which were theological, or some kind of Hegelian. What kind of Hegelianism can explain that? Are you crazy? So she was always asking you, what is unprecedented? Use your eyes, use your experience. And don't, she would have hated the idea of there being Arendtians.
Yeah.
Yeah, she really would have. I mean, when people, and they said it of me as well, the Arendt cult.
Yeah.
It's usually the left who say this, and they think, good lecture me on cult. Like, really? So I think it's the two. I think that what she was describing has been, there is a continuity there that maybe the Cold War obscured. If we talk about, the big section in the middle of Origins of Totalitarianism, of imperialism, read what she says about Russia. There is a continuity, but at the same time, there are different means, there are different things, and we need to think. I think she'd have just called for courage.
Mm.
Thank
you so much.
Understand Arendt, you can't be an Arendtian.
Exactly.
Yeah. Yeah.
Good point to that.
Yeah.
The audience and kind of, I don't know, you're all here, if there's anyone online as well.
I'll repeat it for the online audience. Yeah.
Thanks. I wondered if you could speak a little bit about whether Arendt loved herself and maybe about shame and her notion of becoming in comparison to the right.
So it's a question for the online audience about whether or not Arendt loved herself, and this important distinction she made between the parvenu and the pariah.
Yeah, that's such a good question. Thank you. I think she did. I think she did. I think she was quite tough on herself. I mean, if you look at some of the archive after the fallout from the Eichmann affair, it's kind of heartbreaking. Samantha Rose Hill has just got a new translation of her poems out, and it hadn't dawned on me before that she stopped writing poetry after the Eichmann trial. I think she embraced her pariahness, and that's one of the things I really like about her. I mean, her one-liners about, I'm sorry to be difficult, but it's just where I am. Or when she was made a professor at Princeton, first woman professor, and she was furious because they kept on saying, we've appointed a woman, it was like, and a new journalist, New York Times journalist said to her, so what does it feel like to be the first woman professor? And she turns around and she says, well, I've been a woman for quite some time now, and I think I can manage it. So I think she did play up the pariah. She didn't play up the pariah thing, but I think she saw it as a position of integrity. I don't think that worked so much with the Eichmann, but all the way through Paris into New York, I think it did. And I think it did definitely give her a position from which to think from. And yeah, if you're going to be a pariah, you have to kind of like yourself. Great question, thank you.
Can I ask a question? Is that?
Yeah.
I'm really interested in the relationship with Baldwin.
Yeah.
Who I love, and there's similarities there in terms of the kind of poetic and how they speak on love as well. And as you were speaking, I thought, is love, because there is, what is the answer? What is that political system that gives the answers? And I wondered if we could speak on whether, and you talked about beginnings, whether love is the beginning but not the practice or the process, whether love is how you begin again. So in quite a lot of my work, you have to keep love out there. People just don't.
Yeah. They don't love each other.
They don't love each other.
Yeah.
Whatever.
Yeah.
So what you said, you then start to choose who you love and who you don't.
Yeah.
But that spark, love, is the beginning.
Yeah.
And then there must be something that comes after that then returns you
Yeah.
to that beginning.
Yeah. I think that's really good way of putting it. She wanted to call the human condition for the love of the world. And I think I mean, that's why I think it's such an extraordinary book. 'Cause The Origins of Totalitarianism was the book about how did this happen? How did totalitarianism happen? And The Human Condition is the book where she tries to strip away all of that. So that's where she goes back to the Greeks and Christianity and Romans and tells these stories. But I also think on a personal level, there is a sense of if you don't love the world, you're not going to fight for anything. So you have to cultivate a love of the world. And the way she talked about the world isn't just like here and now. The world is something that exists between us. I mean, none of us are entirely in it. We all have to have a bit that's outside. She said it's like the table that sits between us. But also the world is history. I mean, the world is, lots of our ancestors loved the world enough not to trash it too much. Some of them didn't love it enough and did. So her sense of like what our responsibility is for a love of the world. And that's where she'd start from. Because if you love the world, you are going to fight for it without, exactly as you say, starting to police who's lovable, who isn't. I mean, she would have hated cancel culture for that reason, not because she was a free speech warrior, which she would have been. But she said, this is not reality. Reality is plural and difficult and annoying, and people are plural and difficult and lovable and hateable. But the baseline has to be, in the beginning, there was love, and then there was the world.
Yeah, absolutely. Because it requires a great amount of strength to begin again.
Yeah.
Each day. I think it's easier just to continue on, as we see, people just continue on that path. Whether it's a path of love, even if sometimes something else is needed, or whether it's the tyranny where again something else is needed.
Yeah.
How do we then find the energy, the enthusiasm, the empathy to begin again?
Yeah.
Each time, which I find very interesting. It's quite often we stay as we are.
Yeah.
And we don't want to get off that route.
But also there's a whole population that is constantly having to begin again. So we talk about mass displacement, migration, the non-jobs, the gig economy, and people are constantly having to begin again, with the rest of us going, it's going to stay the same. So we're kind of really out of kilter with the experience of the world when it comes to that.
There's a power in that, though, isn't there? My mum always says to me, the strength is in the struggle.
Second volume, the number of loudspeakers, BCG, highest pitch of.
Yeah.
The struggle, the suffering. It's perhaps not there because you've not had to begin. It's
Yeah.
consistently growth, and we talk about growth.
Yeah.
It's a really,
Monastic
I
living
really find that fascinating what the answer is.
online.
That was amazing. Thank you so much. Like changing the subject a little bit, Hannah Arendt was clearly drawn to trials, Nuremberg and Eichmann. I wonder, has she written about justice and what her interpretation of justice is, and what her relationship with justice is?
Yeah. Well, she wrote a lot about judgment. Justice she found more tricky. What I would say though, actually, she didn't attend Nuremberg. Well, she didn't want to go back at that point, but she followed it very carefully. And one of the things she said to Karl Jaspers, she said, I'm really worried about this trial because I think the Nazis have exploded the limits of the law, which is to say, I don't know how we're going to be able to put this back. I don't know how we're going to invent a legal system that can deal with this new crime, not the crime of anti-Semitism, which we all know is a very old crime, but a crime against humanity committed on the body of the Jewish people, she phrased it. And Jaspers, who was her teacher, said, careful, don't give the Nazis the demonic qualities that they want. Don't give it to them. You have to work out what is banal and prosaic. And so it was the banal phrase came from Jaspers, and she kind of thought about it for 20 years. And then that's why she was so excited by the trial in Jerusalem, because she was finally, the crime against Jewish people is going to be addressed, which it had not been. It was not in Nuremberg. There were very few Jewish witnesses. There was anti-Semitism in the back room meant that the specific crime of the Holocaust was muted all the way deliberately through, this history. No first witness. So she thought this is what Jerusalem might offer was a new framework to think about crimes against humanity. She agreed with the judgment, and she had a lot of time for a bit of the judgment, but she still didn't think that the notion of justice, we haven't got a notion of justice that's adequate to what has been let loose in the world. And I don't think she ever thought that that would be solvable. In her archive, there are quite a lot of notes that she made on Nuremberg, which someone needs to look at more carefully. But so that's where someone who's maybe interested. Yeah, so I think, and also I think she at the end, I think she thought, we can't, justice, I mean, what would justice look like? I think so she was more concerned towards the end about, judgment, creating context of judgment and prevention. Because just as the crime was unimaginable, it was very difficult to imagine what possibly would, except for the law to work harder.
Before she became, she also became the judge at the end of Eichmann.
Yeah.
She agreed with the judgment.
Oh yeah.
But thought they got to it in the wrong way.
Yeah.
And then told them how they should have actually come to the judgments.
Yeah.
Take this question to the one online.
Yeah, I'd love to know about the conversations you're having with her in your head at this point now, and just kind of whether you were talking about continuities. But do you see, like, how would she historicize this moment in terms of, like, you described the boomerang from empire to fascism? Is there like a boomerang from fascism to now, or is it more?
Yeah. I think it's a really.
Could we just repeat that? So
Yeah.
I keep. Do you want to try repeating that?
No, I like it.
So, Arendt thought there was a sort of boomerang from empire, the sins of empire, to fascism, and the way that took over in Europe. And so it's a question of the continuities. Is there a boomerang again now? So what do you think Arendt would have made it now?
I think she would have thought it was more of a continuity. She wrote the last paper was called Chickens Home to Roost, was actually a person who first used that was Malcolm X. But it was at the end of, Vietnam had just collapsed. You'd had the helicopters coming off, Watergate, Pentagon Papers. And I think it's a heartbreaking piece because she says, look, everyone can see that America lost that war. And what's worse, that Pentagon Papers reveal that America made that war. No one actually believed in the domino theory. No one actually believed in strategic advance. They kept on doing it because they had this image of American greatness and the leader of democracy. That's why people died, and that's why it failed. And she came up with the notion of the big lie there, which Timothy Snyder picked up again after the attack on the Capitol, after Trump lost the election. But I think Timothy got it kind of slightly wrong, because she wasn't just talking about one big lie, like I won the election, which absolutely is a feature of totalitarian regimes. The bigger lie was that America is great, non-imperialist, and brilliant. And she was saying, as long as once you start doing that, you're in real trouble. And she was saying, let the chickens come home to roost. Let America, and this is why she's echoing Malcolm X at this point, let America see what it is. Then it can begin again. So I think that moment, which does lead up to now, and it goes all the way through the Iraq War, post 9/11, the myth that the Cold War gave America of triumph, and this is where we end up now.
If you join the chat late, so the question didn't come through, so I told him to send it to me differently.
Is it the question?
Yeah.
I'll read it out.
You need to get more mics. So this is a question. Is this a question from Carl or Joseph?
This one's from Joseph.
Oh, okay, then Carl, okay, then we're going to come to Carl. Apologies, Carl. Okay, my question, I feel I need to ask this in this moment. What do you think Arendt would have said about Gaza? We know about her move away from Zionism. I wonder in particular what she would have thought about the ICC genocide case and what she thought about genocide convention in her writing.
Really important, difficult question. I was asked this question a lot immediately after, and I just refused to address it because I think, because like everyone else, I was so bewildered, I was numb, I didn't know where to go. So I did do a bit of diving in the archive, and there are two, well, there's one moment that really stood out for me in her archive. The two bits of reality for her were that Jewish assimilation had not worked in Europe. Europe was not a good place to be a Jewish person. So she believed in a Jewish homeland. She did not believe that that homeland should be based on ethnic or religious principles. She thought it should be a bipartite state. At one point, she thought it should be a member of the Commonwealth, which I thought was wonderful. There's a really good fiction to be written there somewhere. Or yeah, part of the Commonwealth or part of Europe, which is, again, a good fiction to be written. But there was, in 1967, on the eve of the war, June 67, there's a letter that comes out in the New York Times signed by like everyone from America. And this is on the eve of the invasion. And among those people were Ralph Ellison, Lionel Trilling, Mary McCartney, everyone who's who of America. And they were saying, you know, the world has to step up. It cannot in all conscience allow this to happen. So it's one of these things that you can't quite imagine happening now, but it happened. Big thing. A few days later, Yehudi Menuhin phones her, telegrams and says, "Look, I'm holding an organization. Will you come and talk?" And she goes, "Yes, but I can't because I'm out. But I'm absolutely here, you know, to defend Israel." Then she gets a letter from an organization called the American Professors for Peace in the Middle East. Will she let her name be used? Yes, she says, of course. You know, that's what American professors should be doing, is working for peace in the Middle East. 2 months later, you get this letter, this furious letter from Iran to the American Professors for Peace in the Middle East and said, "I've read your material. Take my name off your publicity. You're a Zionist front," she basically says. And then she says this sentence, which blew my mind. She says, "I have always and will always support Israel. I will never sign up to Zionist propaganda." And I sat there thinking, you couldn't say that sentence. That sentence would not be heard now. It just would not be heard, even though I suspect a lot of us say it. And what she meant was, yes, there has to be a homeland. No, there does not have to be Zionism. And this is typical Arendt. She's saying, you know, you can think both these things at once. Those two things can be true at once. And I don't think it kind of works. It doesn't work for this context because a lot has changed since 1967. And certainly a lot in Israel has changed, none of which she would have approved of. So I think she might have been a bit more hardline. She'd been pretty Masha-Gessen at this point, if not more. But what she would have insisted on is you have to think counterfactual things together at the same time and start from there. Otherwise, there will be carnage. On to the genocide question, which is brilliant, and I don't quite know how to answer. Again, I think you should be really wary of big category legal work or big category political work, doing the harder work for us. And when Gaza happened, I would happen to be reading Emily Wilson's new translation of the Iliad, which is brilliant. And if you're an English speaker, it's really distressing because she puts it in iambic pentameter, so it sounds very familiar. And I had to stop reading it because it was just too horrible. I was so close. War, hostages, slaughter, endless, awful horror. And then I went back to what Arendt said about the Iliad, and she said Homer was the first historian. And then she says, an attack on any nation, population, if you, she doesn't use the word genocide, but if you annihilate a people, you're not only annihilating a people, you're annihilating the plurality of the world, which is to say any attack on any group of people isn't just about that group of people. It's about, going back to your earlier point, Pascal, it's about the world. that's what you're attacking and you must not do it. And then she says of Homer, so the genius of Homer was when you read the Iliad, and it's totally true, you don't know whose side he's on. And that's not because he's a lofty old posh Greek bloke who said, you know, I could sit up here and work out who's right and who's wrong. It's just because he's going back to the imagination, go back to education, it's just because he's telling the story from different angles all the time. He's telling the story about a genocide. That's what happened to Troy. Troy was wrecked. But he's allowing the people from Troy to live and the Greeks to live by telling that story. And I think she would have wanted us to try harder, which isn't about being objective or being a bear, or she would have wanted us to try harder to make that world in the midst of course, you know, the Iliad is the first kind of national horror book.
Fantastic. I'm going to bring the last question before we close to Carl online. Hopefully.
Am I being heard? Hello?
Yes.
Can you hear me?
Yes. Yes.
Oh, hello. What a wonderful event. And thanks, Jonathan, for the invite. And I say hi to Cora. It reminds me of when I was a bit younger, and I traveled quite a bit with Matthew Lipman. He's a Jewish philosopher from America, and he always insisted on the important factor of conversation. So what a wonderful conversation you presented to us. And the need for our planet to cultivate, especially in the schools and colleges, this idea of conversation. I also listened with great interest this idea of judgment. And actually, English is a second language to me. And I learned the difference from Matthew Lipman between the word judgment and judgmental. Unfortunately, so many political leaders, especially the big current ones, are usually judgmental rather than passing good judgment. But out of curiosity, I'd like to pose a question to you, the panel. How can we define the human condition? What ideas do you have? Bless you all. See you soon, Jonathan. Bye-bye.
Just an easy.
Thank you, Carl.
Thank you.
We maybe should have begun with that question. I will put it to you, just to briefly, is there hope to be able to answer that question?
Well, there's always hope.
I don't know. Arendt talked about reckless hope. I always think of that great book by Bloch on hope. Where he says it's not desire. Where Freud says you're always plagued by the past and desire, and it determines everything and wrecks your life. And he says no, it's hope. And it's this huge, wonderful book about how we keep on hoping, and like he uses things like sport. It's like this is where hope is wrong. So I think going back, the really important thing about judgment is the capacity to look at the world from elsewhere. And that, I think, is important. But I think the human condition is the capacity to love and to begin again. And our job as educators and people with real privilege is to guard like hell the places where that is possible, where people can learn to do that. I think that's where.
Thank you so much. That's a fantastic way to end. I would just like to thank you for a fantastic insight and conversation. And what I would say is to take these conversations away. Don't let them just exist in these rooms. Please take them away and have those conversations everywhere that we are. So if we can put our hands together for Lyndsey and our great conversation that we've had. Thank you so much.